All right, hello and welcome to today's Haas webinar. This is a quick guide to ADA drinking fountain compliance. Today we will be covering the ADA standard and its requirements as it pertains to drinking fountains, their installation and performance. However, there is no clear-cut way or easy way to explain the standard and its requirements. There is a lot of information in the ADA, but I think we've done a really good job at compiling the information into something that is understandable and digestible. My name is Justin Dunn. I'm the sales product specialist / trainer for Haas. With me is our guest panelist and ADA expert, Kelly Guilfoy with Specification Sales. And also with me is Samantha Hoke, our marketing and communications strategist.
Good morning. Thanks everybody for being here.
Okay, so moving on. Please feel free to post questions at any time using the control panel. We will begin answering these questions during the Q&A portion of the webinar at the end, and any that cannot be answered within our time frame will be addressed in a follow-up email. We will also be launching poll questions throughout the presentation. They're not that many, I promise, but these help us to continually improve the quality of our presentation and modify the content. Your participation is really greatly appreciated on those. The follow-up email I mentioned will be sent within 24 to 48 hours after the presentation and will include the following materials: the recording of the webinar, the presentation slides, as this is a lot to remember, even those well-versed in the ADA, so don't worry too much about note-taking, as well as additional support materials, which is marketing speak for handy stuff that may come in useful to you at a later date and time. A little bit about who we are and why Haas is especially suited to discuss the intricacies of drinking fountains and the ADA. Our founder, Luther Haas, invented and patented the modern drinking fountain. Prior to this, it was common to have a public fountain that you could buy a fancy cup for it, a chain, and it would be a communal drinking fountain, meaning everyone was sharing the same cup, and that's gross. So drinking fountains, thank you, Luther. Ever since Luther's innovation, we've been focused on building quality drinking fountains that last and serve our global community and the long-term needs of our market. As we go into the 5th generation of family ownership, we pride ourselves on having long-lasting products and our commitment to educating others about all aspects of other products and their necessity. In short, we know drinking fountains real good. Our agenda today includes an overview of ADA legislation on drinking fountains, common ADA installation issues with fun-filled examples, and lastly, ADA compliant drinking fountain and bottle filler installations. Okay, so before we get started, we're going to launch our poll question number 1. Again, your participation is really greatly appreciated.
Great, thank you, Justin. So on your screen, we'd like to know, what is your role when it comes to drinking fountains? If none of the below, please do not respond. We'd like to know, do you help select the product? Do you specify the product in plans? Do you purchase our product or others' product, install the product, or maintain the product? For the remaining polls, I like to give about 40 seconds to allow the attendees to fill in their answer. So we'll have a little bit of quiet time. Great, thanks for your participation. Back to you, Justin.
Okay, now, the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's civil rights legislation. It was passed by Congress on July 26, 1990, and was signed into law by the late, great George H.W. Bush, and gave reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities. Its core message was to prevent discrimination based on a person's disabilities, and was a huge civil rights win, giving access to those who desperately needed our consideration. There would not have been an ADA without the disability rights movement. Justin Dart, for example, was a huge part of the movement and was present at the signing of the bill. If you are familiar with the now past mogul, he himself was confined to a wheelchair and was considered to be the godfather of the ADA. The ADA is enforced by the Department of Justice, who have filed hundreds of lawsuits over the years enforcing civil rights legislation for a wide array of nonconformances. Lawsuits are a typical byproduct of noncompliance, doing some serious damage monetarily, not to mention damaging a company's reputation. In a world where social media rules, everything gets shared, and discrimination against disabled people would be a pretty damaging allegation. At a bare minimum, we're talking reinstallations, which can be pretty costly. All right, here's the meat of it. This is the number to remember, 28 CFR Part 36, Title 3. And its message is non-discrimination on the basis of disability by public accommodations and in commercial facilities. In other words, where we have given access to the disabled, let there be accessible accommodations for those needing it. This section of the ADA will be our topic for the webinar. And before we begin, I want to address a common question we get about the grandfather clause in the ADA. It did exist. It no longer exists. In 1991, existing small businesses and buildings were allowed to avoid making changes unless they added new construction or renovated their property. This was removed in 2010, and in its place, we got a tricky provision called the Safe Harbor Rule. If you had an element that was compliant in 1991 in that act, and that rule was changed in the 2010 Act, then you need not comply unless the building was renovated or altered. If the 2010 Act addressed something new that was not included in the 1991 Act, then compliance was required. This provision, however, does, and they changed a lot. This provision, however, does not apply to major inclusion in the Act, which was recreational facilities, pools, golf, bowling alleys, etc. These places must remove barriers as it is readily achievable to do so, which is a slippery legal term. Many of these situations include drinking fountains, and as a best practice, we should all be complying with the 2010 requirements. Otherwise, you may fall victim to expensive lawsuits, sometimes known as drive-by lawsuits, etc. This topic could get its own hour-long webinar, if I'm being entirely honest. Okay, so we're going to start in section 36.403, or with 36.403, I should say, which gives us a list based on priority for what makes or what to make alterations to, and in what order when providing an accessible facility. Now, drinking fountains is number 5 on the list of priorities, even above parking as a priority, which is one of the most lawsuit-heavy issues out there. Whether it is a new building or an alteration to an existing property, considerations must be made for each of these in order, and compliance has to be taken seriously. Now, ADA requirements are not limited to adults. It is important to note that children are included in the standard and are defined as anyone aged 12 years or younger. Until the 2010 ADA standards, children were often an afterthought or a case-by-case basis when considering installation of drinking fountains. This is the first time ever that there has been a uniform national standard for children's fountain dimensions, and it's really important. Chapter 2, under scoping requirements, dictates that where there is a fountain required, that a second must be provided, one high and one low. The high side fountain is in place for standing persons with bending or stooping disabilities, like someone using a walker or crutches, for example, while the low side fountain is intended for wheelchair accessibility. There are no drinking fountains designed for able-bodied people. Design is focused on those who need help with accessing this equipment easily, as able-bodied people will have no issues accessing either. The Haas Model 1011 HPS, a high polish model in the photo, is a good example of how high-low fountains are installed. It's important to remember that the ADA, however, does not stipulate the number of fountains required in your facility. That is determined by local building code and the load capacity. There's a common misconception that the ADA gives you the number of drinking fountains required. This is not the case. Okay, now while 2 fountains are required, where there is one required by local building code, we have section 211.3 that gives us the 50-50 rule and an exception to this rule. The 50-50 rule very simply states that half of whatever number of fountains are installed must be high fountains. and other half must be low fountains. So if we have 8 fountains to install, 4 will need to be high and 4 will need to be low. Our exception to this rule is uh, not really much of an exception. It's where a fraction is yielded and allows us to decide whether the odd fountain will be a high or a low fountain. So if we have 9 fountains, 4 can be high, 4 can be low, and the last is our decision. It can be a high or low fountain, whichever it is that you prefer in your facility, as long as the minimum number of fountains is installed. There's also nothing that saying that these fountains must be side by side. As long as the requirements for a space or floor of a building are met, one of each could be provided at opposite ends of a hallway, for example, but they are typically found in the same area or usually near restrooms in a facility. Chapter 3, titled Building Blocks, does not specifically pertain to drinking fountains, but are very important to the installation considerations regarding fountains. Element is a term that you're going to hear from me quite a bit and pops up in the ADA quite a bit. And it's a term that refers to the component that we are granting access to. Sections like this can make it easy to miss an important requirement in the ADA since it doesn't call out drinking fountains specifically, but is absolutely required. Examples of other elements may include a fire extinguisher, baby changing tables, sinks, anything else that we're granting access to in these facilities. Here's your first measurement requirement, and one that you are going to hear me say a lot for the rest of the presentation, and one that you would do well to remember. Clear floor space for a forward or parallel approach to an element must be 30 by 48 inches. That is the clear floor space required for a wheelchair. This space is designed to allow for easy access to an element using a wheelchair. The two illustrations that you see are examples of both a forward and parallel approach. Just pretend there's a drinking fountain there. This drawing was lifted straight from the Access Board website and gives you a much better example of a forward and parallel approach to an element. The elements in these illustrations being a fire extinguisher and a phone, the yellow area on the floor being the 30 by 48 inches of clearance that must be provided. The reason this measurement is so important is because maneuverability in a wheelchair can be very difficult, and we need to make sure that we're not providing an obstacle course to gain access to an element or basic necessity. Speaking again to maneuverability, many states and jurisdictions require drinking fountains to be located in alcoves out of the path of travel. California is a perfect example. Section 305.7 states that additional maneuvering space is required in an alcove for a wheelchair-bound person, while 305.7.1 and 0.7.2 gives us the specifics for the type of approach, being forward and parallel approach. The clear floor space only changes when the depth of an alcove for forward or parallel approach exceeds a certain depth. So for a forward approach, we need to provide 36 inches instead of 30 inches in width when the alcove exceeds 24 inches. So if it's deeper than 2 feet, we need to widen that alcove to allow for easier access. And on a parallel approach, we must provide 60 inches instead of the normal 48 inches when the depth of the alcove exceeds 15 inches. Remember that all of these are minimum requirements. This illustration is important because it really demonstrates, well, I think, that the clear floor space that we have been discussing is not limited to a two-dimensional shape on the floor. It extends up to the fountain from the floor. So 306.2 and 3 require toe and knee clearance in addition to the clear floor space. 9-inch minimum for your toes and 27 inches for your knees. Without these clearances, it could be a challenge for someone to get close enough to access the bubbler head or the bottle filler. I have examples of obstructions in this space coming up. That 27 inches is going to be important to us a little bit later too. It's important for cane detection, which I'll go over. And we're getting to poll question number 2. Sam, if you would launch that, please.
Yes. On your screen, we'd like to know which brands do you specify most or have in your facility. You may select all that apply. Great, thank you.
All right, moving on. So this section applies to the visually impaired, and while they are capable of using a fountain without any special requirements, this section does impact the installation and design of our drinking fountains because the visually impaired use a detection cane, and when objects are not detectable by that cane, sight impaired people run into things. And this section gives us the requirements to provide walkways with detectable equipment in place to avoid accidents and injuries, and it is incredibly important. The magic number here is, again, and I mentioned earlier, 27 inches. There's a reason we lower our fountains to this measurement. This is the maximum height that an object can protrude at and be detectable by a cane, giving a person enough time to stop before running into that object. This is one of my favorite slides, and this slide breaks it down really well. So objects within the 27-inch maximum height from the ground, they can protrude any amount into a path or a walkway since it is considered detectable by that cane. A similar rule applies for headroom clearance. Objects over 80 inches may protrude any amount because they are considered above headroom clearance. Objects squarely within the 27-inch to 80-inch range cannot protrude any more than 4 inches from the wall to avoid running into them. And there is an exception to that for handrails, which can protrude 4.5 inches. This is why many objects like fire extinguishers, for example, are recessed into the wall. Drinking fountains, when located in an alcove, are considered to be out of the path of travel. But when no alcove is in place, it is important that both fountains meet the 27-inch detection height. The high side fountain is the issue here. We locate the low side at 27 inches to meet knee clearance and detection measurements, and we use a cane skirt on the high side to bring the leading edge, like in the photo, down to a detectable range. This is to be entirely honest, a grossly underutilized tool and is often not installed on the fountain, but it really should be. This is the same fountain I showed you earlier in the presentation, the 1011 HPS, with our SK3 HPS cane skirt attached to it. So you can see the leading edges are both at the same height on the fountain. Reach ranges are an important factor when considering bottle fillers, in addition to or separate from your drinking fountain, but also apply to many other types of equipment such as baby changing tables. Unobstructed forward reach would be when you have no fountain in place and just a bottle filling station, for example. Without an obstruction, the high reach range for activation that you see there on the left of the bottle filler would be 48 inches and a low reach range of 15 inches. When the reach is obstructed, as with a counter-mounted sink or a drinking fountain that protrudes less than 20 inches, as with all Haas drinking fountains, the obstructed reach range for the bottle filler activation would be 48 inches max. But obviously our low reach range disappears since there's an object blocking our reach. For counters or other products that protrude from 20 to 25 inches from the wall, the reach range is reduced a little to a 44-inch max since you're pushed out a little bit and you're reaching over an object to gain access to it. Section 308 includes a DOJ advisory, Department of Justice advisory, introducing children's use reach ranges broken down by age. Now remember, a child, as defined by the ADA, is anyone under the age of 12. This chart is for both forward and side reach and works very similar to the previous chart for adult reach ranges. These measurements can be common in daycares and in schools. When deciding how to design and install fountains and bottle fillers in buildings, thought needs to be put into who the primary users are intended to be in that facility and make the appropriate height adjustment for the element. Heading into Chapter 6, we get into some specifics regarding plumbing elements. Section 602 specifically regarding drinking fountains. 602.2 requires us to center the clear floor space we talked about 30 by 48 inches on the low side fountain, not to be confused with the center of the fountain, which is a common mistake. I'll demonstrate this in a minute. This is very frequently an issue. The exception to this is allowing for a parallel approach to a child's fountain where the spout is 30 inches maximum from the floor and the bubbler is 3.5 inches from the front edge of the fountain. This illustration gives us a much better idea of how the floor space is supposed to look. It must be centered on the element, whether it be the fountain, phone, an outlet, or other equipment. That clear floor space needs to be centered on that element. So you'll notice in our alcove, it's centered on the low side. Since the floor space is intended for the wheelchair user, it needs to be centered on the low side fountain. Some make the mistake of centering the floor space on the center of the fountain between the drinking fountains, which would lead to a tear out, reinstall if we don't have enough space intended for that low side fountain after that. There are many ways to mess this up, and we'll point out some of the most common ones coming up. This image shows an alcove designed based on California's requirement, mandating an additional 2 inches on top of the 30-inch ADA measurement for clear floor space. Again, this floor space must be centered on the low side fountain and cannot be obstructed in any way. This means that with our clear floor space centered on the fountain, that the distance from the center of the fountain to the wall needs to be 16 inches. And if you want an aesthetically pleasing and dimensionally proportionate design, the total width of the alcove will need to be 48 inches total. And since the alcove is not deeper than 24 inches, there is no need to further modify the width. Remember, our clear floor space changes based on the depth of the alcove. It has to be widened. Now, I haven't said it out loud yet, but you may have noticed that I haven't mentioned clear floor space for a high side fountain, and that is because there are no requirements. We do have a generally agreed upon space that I'll cover later more thoroughly. But what this means, though, is that if we have issues with the clear floor space centered on the low side fountain, we can shove that high side against the wall to make an alcove work if it's absolutely necessary. Having said that, the high side is for people with stooping and bending disabilities, which means the use of walkers, canes, and other devices, and they need space too. So careful consideration should be taken when designing this area. Okay, poll question number 3.
Thanks, Justin. We would like to know, what is the most important benefit to you or your clients? If none of the below, please do not respond, but you may also select all that apply. Great, thanks everyone for your participation.
Yeah, again, your participation is greatly appreciated in this. Thank you very much. Moving on, this excerpt is directly from the California Building Code. And in keeping with California's usual behavior, they have added paragraph 602.9, requiring all drinking fountains to be in alcoves or to be alcoved using wing walls or guardrails, which is commonly used on exterior wall-mounted fountains or standalone fountains that address play areas, for example. Texas, Connecticut, and Georgia are some others that I've learned of. If we don't pay careful attention to detail and make this equipment accessible, it only takes one person to notice and know better for this to become an issue, leading to tear-outs, redesigns, labor, litigation that can all become very expensive. So with that said, let's go over some examples. This is one of my favorites. Here we see the first of many to come and what happens to be one of the most common installation issues. What you are seeing under the right low side fountain is a gas line. I'm pretty sure it's a gas line. It is currently obstructing our clear floor and toe space for wheelchair access. I think that people generally see fountains and they don't stop to think about who these are really intended for and why it's so important to avoid situations like this. This problem could really easily have been fixed by swapping the fountains. If the high side fountain had been located on the right, low on the left, there would have been plenty of room for left for toe and knee clearance, since we don't have standing room requirements for the high side. Alcoved installations are very typically the culprit when we're talking non-compliance and a lack of accessibility. While having an alcove installation, in my opinion, is a much more sensible installation than locating them in the walkway. It is probably the future of insulation for more states to come. It is a bit easier to mess this kind of installation up. There are so many additional considerations that have to be taken into account with this type of installation. Alcove width, depth, placement, and height of the fountains, toe clearance, knee clearance, and all. Of course, the design of the alcove way before it even gets a fountain installed into it. So very important and easy to mess up. This alcove is finished with 2-inch tile, and we only have about 12 inches from the center line of the low side fountains to the sidewall of the alcove on the left, which would be 3 inches short on our clear floor space. And if you've never been in a wheelchair or tried to navigate a room in one, it can be very difficult. 3 inches can make a huge difference to somebody. This would be a tear out. Remember, it only takes one person to know better and to say something before this turns into something, somebody's expensive redesign. Here we have 4-inch tile, giving us a total of 14 inches to the wall, which is, with our federal guidelines, is only 1 inch short of being compliant. But in California, where we are required to have 32 inches of clearance centered on the fountain, we are now 2 inches short. Again, we are trying to make these as easy to access as possible. Nobody needs to struggle to get a basic necessity of human life. Now, you might be asking yourself, Justin, how many people in wheelchairs carry around a measuring tape? And the answer is all of them. It comes with the wheelchair. Your basic adult manual wheelchair is 26 inches wide on to the outside of the wheels, leaving only an additional 2 inches on either side for your hands, which they are painfully aware of. 3 inches in California. You become an expert of gauging what areas you will and will not fit into. And if I'm being denied access to something, I'm going to be pretty upset too. This alcove was probably just a mistake in that they added the tile after the design of the alcove, shortening the alcove by just too much. Now to briefly go back and touch on section 602.2, again regarding clear floor space and the installation of children's use fountains. Children in the ADA have been defined as 12 years of age or younger, and children range wildly in height, if you were not aware. I don't know what it is. Some spread into giants, some do not. What this section gives us is an exception to section 306 for toe and knee clearance, allowing us to lower an ADA fountain below our 27-inch knee clearance to provide a child height drinking fountain. Giving us an option for a parallel approach to the fountain so long as the bubbler does not exceed 30 inches from the finished floor and has a bubbler that is not deeper than 3.5 inches into the bowl of the fountain. Children's wheelchairs are very often adult wheelchairs, if I'm being honest. Custom wheelchairs can be expensive, not frequently thought of as a good option since children grow so quickly. So providing child height ADA fountains can be a little tricky. These are often found in places like schools and daycares, since it is assumed that in public that if you are a child in need of accessing a drinking fountain, that you are with an adult that can assist you. Remember, though, that these are federal requirements. State and local authorities may not allow for a side approach to the fountain and could require a front approach. So make sure to consult your local code as well before moving forward with an installation. This is a bad one. They drop the high-low unit. So the typically adult ADA fountain is being used as the child height fountain, and the high side adult standing fountain is now the ADA wheelchair accessible unit. They also used what should have been the child fountain on the far right as the standing unit. In short, the center fountain is intended to be for wheelchair access here, and we now have a lot of issues. The center fountain is now too close to the wall to easily reach, and it is being obstructed by the far left fountain, preventing this from being easily accessible. Remember that we need 30 inches wide by 27 inches tall for someone to easily maneuver into access this fountain. Now, I'm going to give you a good example of how this should have been done in a moment here. But first, let me showcase these Haas white enameled cast iron drinking fountains that I am going to use to demonstrate a proper installation with. These fountains, along with many of our other designs, were specifically created for this type of situation. Now, this might sound mean, but you're the only ones that can mess this up. This equipment ships out the doors compliant with instructions, but it doesn't always end up on the wall that way. Haas equipment is designed with the ADA standard in mind and isn't provided to you with very detailed instructions for compliance, but if they are not adhered to and someone throws the instructions out the window or doesn't consult local building code, it can mean some problems down the road. So similar to what you saw in the photo, we have a good looking high-low drinking fountain on the right and a single fountain on the left. Every time I see these too, these like classic schoolyard designs, it always reminds me of like kindergarten, middle school, the good old days, gummy bears and using crayons for homework. First, we install a standard set of high-low drinking fountains at the manufacturer's recommended dimensions to meet the ADA standards. Then we are going to use a single drinking fountain mounted at children's height with a bubbler not higher than 30 inches on the far right. Now you will notice a measurement of 24 inches under the child fountain. This measurement is specific to fountains, but is instead, it's not specific to fountains, but is instead adopted from clearances for lavatories and sinks. The cascading design is typically what you'd find in an airport, hospital, school, etc. And gives the fountains a nice aesthetically pleasing design. You could relocate the child fountain to the far left and avoid the 30-inch clearance we have to provide for the wheelchair accessible unit. Notice how the child fountain is set up a bit further away. We would just lose that nice cascading design in that alcove or on that wall. So you can see clearly here that our clear floor space for the center fountain is being met. We have our 30 inches by 27 inches, and of course 48 inches out from the wall. We also have the 15-inch, 16 for California, for the center line of the wheelchair accessible fountain to the side of the child height to ensure clearance. So center line to center line, it's 22 inches since the child fountain is it's 14 inches wide. The same installation could be achieved using our 1107 series fountain, which is a bit more of a lobby customer-facing type design. These are designed with 14 gauge stainless steel and uses a 1/4 inch thick steel plate in the wall to make it as durable as possible, aiding and supporting those who may need to use the fountain to keep themselves stable on their feet and to resist the younger, more destructive among us who might wish to attempt to do damage to one of these tanks. These are highly vandal resistant and would assist in both scenarios. So let's jump into some outdoor installation issues. This one is a high-low Haas model 3300. Speaking of tanks, this thing is nigh indestructible, but it has unfortunately been installed too close to the wall, making a forward approach to the fountain very difficult. Even in an outdoor situation, we need to adhere to all of the requirements that I've covered so far. Even alcoves or types of alcoves. Remember that the clear floor space is required to be centered on the drinking fountain. This one is way too close, limiting access to the fountain. Remember, it's 30 inches wide. It doesn't seem like a lot, but a field inspector could force a tear out and reinstall in this type of situation. Let's go through another example. So what you see here is our 3150. This is an outdoor concrete drinking fountain. A unique feature of this fountain is that the arm can be adjusted for both adult or child height ADA compliance. As these typically go into parks, and parks are highly populated by children, it's a pretty handy feature. Now, the approach to these fountains and the direction in which the bubbler head is facing is an important factor for determining how these should be installed in regards to their surroundings, especially in parks where you have multiple types of terrains, including grass, dirt, and concrete. Now, if everyone has been paying attention so far, and I know you have been, then you will notice that the above installation is a compliant outdoor installation. If the fountain is positioned against a wall, a building, railing, anything else, then it needs to be positioned so that the center line of the wheelchair accessible fountain is a minimum of 15 inches from that wall to accomplish our 30-inch clear ground space, and of course 48 inches out from the base of the fountain, hopefully positioned out of the pedestrian walkway. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier, but here are the measurements. So in practice, so an adult walker is about 25 inches wide, with some variations depending on the person's preference. So 30 by 30 is our measurement. So 30 by 38 inch space is generally agreed upon as enough room for the high side drinking fountain for a person with stooping or bending disabilities. And that's again to accommodate whatever it is that they happen to be using, whether it's a walker, crutches, etc. At a minimum, we would need at least 69 inches wide for the concrete pad to accommodate these measurements. So just overall. Here's another example. Most parks will have a pad poured specifically for a drinking fountain or another feature, so that those elements can be positioned out of the path of travel in the park. But if this pad is not proportioned correctly, it can lead to a lot of issues. So in this illustration, to accommodate the drinking fountain located out of the path of travel, the pad was poured into a grassy area. We would need 69 inches by 52 inches in this area to easily accommodate both the standing and ADA approaches to the fountain. So it takes quite a chunk of space to make sure that we're providing enough space for access to this easily. Oftentimes, drinking fountains can be located in a high traffic area in a park near recreational areas and can be alcoved with guardrails to keep the fountains out of the path of travel and makes the fountain more easily detectable for persons with blindness. All other requirements remain the same for the approach and for clear ground space around the unit. The guardrails need to be long enough to protect the fountain so that no part of the fountain is protruding beyond the guardrails, again, to assist with detection. We have a wide array of outdoor fountains that can meet ADA accessibility, providing vandal resistance and a decorative look for your fit and design. This was an exciting new addition to our lineup, and it offers a unique set of benefits to those designing an outdoor drinking fountain and bottle filler area since it's modular. Each of the pieces can be indexed in different directions or accommodate different situations in your park and needs, including bottle fillers, drinking fountains, dog bowls being easily my favorite thing ever. So in practice, so this unit offers, it's about 200 different configurations. The fountain and the bottle filler can be indexed in any direction again, or swapped out for something different. Installation is a cinch, and it offers a new design for parks or recreational areas for architects looking for something fresh. It also offers options for adult, ADA, and child height installations, which is important. Now in January of last year, the ANSI A 117.1-2009 standard was given an update. If you didn't know, the ANSI standard was used as the basis for the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design. These updates to the ANSI standard included the addition of bottle filling stations to the drinking fountains, section 602, as you see on the screen. 602.4 is indicating that bottle fillers must adhere to 602.4.1 and .2 regarding clear floor space, which is again 30 by 48 inches, and that the controls be either hand operated or automatic, sensor operated otherwise, which will also need to adhere to our reach ranges. But I'll talk more about that in a moment. Now, if a bottle filler is not provided for both fountains, which is generally the case, then the one bottle filler must be located on the low side to allow access to wheelchair-bound people. If the bottle filler is on the low side, we can assume both the wheelchair-bound person and the standing person can access the bottle filler. But if it's installed on the high side, then we wouldn't want to deny anyone because they can't reach it. But providing two is absolutely fine. I'll sell you two, I promise. So especially if you have a high traffic area or the fountains are, if they're separated by a hallway or near restrooms located separately. Bottle fillers are allowed as an additional element to a fountain, and they cannot replace a fountain, which is a really common misconception. I don't know how many calls we get where people think, I need a drinking fountain, but I'd really rather have a bottle filler in place and intend to replace it with that, but that cannot be done. They can be added, however, as many as you want, as long as the minimum requirement for the amount of drinking fountains in your facility has been met. Here we have the 1920. This is a retrofittable bottle filler made of the same 14 gauge stainless steel that our fountains are made of. I'm going to use these to demonstrate some compliant installations for bottle fillers onto our fountains. So remember also that if you've met the minimum number of requirements in your building, you can put a bottle filler anywhere you want. It doesn't even have to be located on a fountain, although most are for convenience and obviously the access to water there. So these bottle fillers are they're pretty unique in that they can be very easily retrofitted over existing fountains or used on new installations and can be in both situations compliant. Here it's paired with the Haas 1117 LN dual drinking fountain. It drains directly into the fountain to reduce the need to add additional drainage. It also uses the same front accessible 5874 valve as the fountain, minimizing the need to order different parts to maintain it. The installation drawing on the right shows the fountain in a factory suggested configuration. So our knee clearance is being met, very importantly. The activation for the bottle filler is located at 46 inches above the surface floor of the user. This is 2 inches short from the required 48 inches maximum height required by 308.2.2. This is the same style of bottle filler, but added onto an enameled white cast iron low fountain. Great again for places like schools, since the enameled surface is easy to clean and keeps cool to the touch if installed outdoors in the sun. We don't want kids burning themselves. This installation with bottle filler would meet all the requirements of the 2010 ADA standards and our ANSI compliance. Same type of fountain here in the single version, and if lowered and mounted at ADA children's height, would easily allow for a bottle filler, since the reach height will be under 44 inches max for the unobstructed, or for the obstructed, children's reach ranges from section 308. Remember the chart with the age ranges from earlier. Remember, it scales down as we get to younger ages. So 40 inches for ages 5 through 8 and 36 inches for ages 3 to 4. Now here we have the fountain installed at child height and meeting our knee clearance, maximum height for the bubbler head, and under our 44-inch max reach range. Coming in at 42 and 5/8 inches in the drawing. Compliant. This would be the 1011 MS with the 1920 installed over the low side in a compliant configuration. This is important. Remember that bottle filler needs to be over the low side. We have to have the high, the low. Again, they don't have to be located next to each other, but again, they typically are just because of convenience in the building or installation. This model includes a in-wall mounting frame, an easy access lower panel for the water supply, and optional water fillers if you're wondering what that lower panel is for. Last but not least, for my sales pitch, the H1011.8 with the 1920 and remote chiller concealed behind a matching stainless steel louvered panel below the fountain. Given all of the space you save using a remote chiller, it provides a much easier and roomier experience for the disabled person using the fountain. And as far as we're concerned, the more room, the better. Okay, so we are going to get into our Q&A portion. We always have lots of questions for this particular webinar, so I tried to move at a pretty even pace through this. So in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly Guilfoy, but real quick, this unit is installed in our own Reno Tahoe Airport in the picture. And it's so damn pretty, I couldn't help but want to share it with everybody. So please remember, with all of the information that I have shared in the webinar so far, that there is a purpose behind all of these numbers, beyond compliance. And that purpose is to make sure that what would be a very inaccessible world for an entire class of people accessible. So make sure to keep that in mind. There's a purpose behind this. So remember the ADA's message: non-discrimination based on the basis of disability, and put all this information to good use going forward. So we're going to go into our poll question number 4 before we get into the Q&A, and then we'll get started with the questions.
Thank you, Justin. Our last and final poll question: how frequently do you specify or install a bottle filler in addition to a drinking fountain? Great, thank you.
Okay, this is our FAQ. I'm going to turn this over to Kelly Guilfoy, who, again, if you're not familiar with the man, he is an expert in everything ADA. He is somebody who I have learned a lot from, and am continuously learning from. Sam, go ahead and take over the FAQ, and Kelly Guilfoy, take it away.
Thanks, Justin, and welcome, Kelly. Thanks for being so patient. I know you're beyond excited to answer all of our attendees' questions. Some of the common FAQs, the first is, does everything have to be ADA accessible?
Well, one of every type of building element has to be ADA accessible. So a typical example might be you walk into a public restroom and there may be wash fountains, or I'm sorry, lavatories at different heights, and you'll notice that one of them is accessible. So the rule is 5% of all fixture types, or at least one of every type of fixture.
Got it. Thank you. Next question, are children's height fixtures required by ADA?
While the children's height fixtures are not necessarily required by the ADA, the ADA acknowledges that there is a need for children's height fixtures. And in the beginning of the ADA, before they introduced the children's height requirement, they actually introduced it as an addendum in 1998. What we were seeing is school facilities and elementary schools were being built with all adult dimensioned fixtures to comply with the ADA, and that necessitated children to try to climb up on them in order to get a drink of water. You saw school districts building boxes for children to stand on, and without handrails, a potential for falling, there's a huge liability issue associated with not providing children's height. In addition to that, it makes sense to provide fixtures, both lavatory fixtures and drinking fountain fixtures for children's use as a matter of health and well-being. It just makes a better environment for children to learn and grow.
Thank you. So we have a handful of questions coming in from the audience. Hopefully we'll be able to get to all of them. But as Justin mentioned early on in the webinar, if we don't touch on your question, we will make sure it will be provided in the Q&A document that we send out within the next 7 business days to all attendees. So one of the questions we're getting is, can you briefly share ADA code requirements regarding emergency showers and eye washes?
Yes, everything that's in chapter 3, the building blocks, all those dimensions apply to all building elements. And that means everything you touch, everything you have to navigate around or over, stairs, ramps, grab bars, handrails, doorknobs, everything. It would be foolish to think that you could deny a disabled person in a classroom laboratory setting, for example, access to emergency equipment and emergency egress and anything emergency related. So emergency safety showers and eye washes definitely need to be ADA compliant. If you're putting a school together and you only have one safety shower and eye wash in a classroom, then it must be ADA accessible.
Great. When it comes to an approach, do you find that most states allow side approaches still? I believe California does not allow side approaches.
California specifically requires a front approach to a drinking fountain. They will still allow a side approach to some other devices like a telephone or something like that. But in general, the front approach does a couple of things. It removes the obstruction of the drinking fountain from the path of travel and provides a place for a person to stop and get a drink of water without themselves being run into by someone else. So I think the alcove is become pretty much a national standard. As I travel around the country and I go to different airports, I see the alcove being employed pretty much widespread.
Got it. Next question. Is there a preferred high-low child height drinking fountain and bottle filler you would recommend? And does Haws provide installation instructions for this particular application?
Well, we don't make a one-piece unit that is high, low, and child height. That would require 3 drinking fountains. It would be quite long, about 60 inches or something like that, for the back panel. We don't build one like that, but everybody can use the dimensional information that we've provided in this slideshow to provide the 3 different heights and meet all of the 3 different heights that are required in the ADA standards. A lot of public facilities, Disneyland, places like that, have accommodated this in their designs. Some school districts, like the Los Angeles Unified School District, actually provide drawings that show their architects and engineers doing their projects how to accomplish that goal. If you have questions and would like to see drawings, you can send us an email or me an email, and we can forward information to you that will give you dimensional requirements.
Great, thank you, Kelly. Are there regulations for drinking fountain maintenance?
Well, I don't know that there's an actual regulation for drinking fountain maintenance, but there are a lot of regulations at state levels and education codes that require that you provide drinking water to student body based on occupancy. So depending on the number of students available, that will dictate how many drinking fountains you will need in a school. And if they're not all working, then obviously you are in violation of that requirement, unless you have an abundance of drinking fountains, which would be cost ineffective. But more or less, I think there's enough code compliance information or code requirements that would indicate you do have to keep them maintained. They have to work.
Got it. Along with the knee clearances, is the bubbler or the top of the drinking fountain to meet ADA? Are there any measurement requirements? I do believe, Justin, you went through this, but maybe we could reinstate it.
Well, the bubbler for the adult drinking fountain for the wheelchair users, 36 inches maximum. So it can always be lower than that, but it cannot be any higher than that. The knee clearance, on the other hand, is 27 inches minimum, and that means that the drinking fountain can't be any lower than that. So anywhere in between there is what will dictate your bubbler height. When it comes to child height drinking fountains with a 30-inch bubbler, over the years, many states, a lot of states, California and Texas and Georgia, and I believe state of Massachusetts have had child height dimensions of their own, which required knee clearances and a forward approach. 24 inches has been kind of a standard that's been used in a lot of applications. So if you can meet the 24-inch knee clearance for a forward approach for a child height drinking fountain, and not exceed the 30-inch bubbler height, I think you've just about covered everything in the nation. There may be a few exceptions that I'm not sure of, but I think for the most part that would do it.
Got it. Is there's been a lot of confusion here, and it is kind of a tough part of the ADA standard, but just to clarify, can you clarify, when we reference child height drinking fountain, are we talking about children in a wheelchair?
You know, that's an unclear question, because it doesn't specifically state in the DOJ's exception to the code about the drinking fountain bubbler height at 36 and the 27 inches of knee clearance. It doesn't specifically state that this is a disabled child. However, children are at a disadvantage using these fixtures if they cannot reach them. I think we talked about this. If you are a parent or a grandparent and you saw your child some distance away doing chin-ups on a drinking fountain to try to get a drink of water, I think you'd be horrified. And especially if your child slipped and fell. I think it's pretty clear that child height drinking fountains make sense. They're safer and make a better environment for health and for safety and for the educational growth and development of children.
That's great. We did go through this in the presentation, but there is a question regarding if only one low drinking fountain can be installed to meet ADA compliance and not a high side fountain.
Well, you have to provide them both. And in years past, when the ADA first came out, a lot of people were installing just the wheelchair accessible drinking fountain, and they were getting away with it basically. Unless your building code and building inspection people are challenging you and making you comply with all of the ADA, you can kind of get through it. But the problem is, this is an act, a federal act, which is nationally required for you to observe, and you can be held accountable for not complying with it, regardless of whether your building department said it was okay or not. So I think it would be silly to not observe this to the fullest extent of this law.
Absolutely agreed. We've got time for a couple more questions. I want to let everybody get a chance to get ready for their next not as exciting meeting. But one question is there a construction tolerance for drinking fountain installations? Getting the unit to exactly 27 inches above the finished floor for cane detection and knee clearance can be tricky.
Well, I know that the ADA does have some construction tolerances in it that apply to a variety of things. I don't think they specifically call out drinking fountains, but I have seen drinking fountains be challenged for a half an inch out of dimensions as required by the ADA. I've seen them challenged because they protruded from an alcove. The drinking fountain itself protruded out of the alcove like a half an inch or 3/4 of an inch, or because they were half an inch too low, or the bubbler was a half an inch too high. So I think if you don't meet the dimensions that are in the code, you do stand a chance of being involved in a violation and having to retrofit something or repair the installation.
Yeah, absolutely not worth the risk. We're going to take our last question, and then as you can see, we switched over to our contact us slide. We've got our technical support, contact information, customer service, and we also have a live chat function as well. So Kelly, our last question, I think it was stated in the presentation, but we'll refer to it again. Are bottle fillers considered a replacement for one of the ADA drinking fountains?
So there's a lot of confusion about that. There's actually in the Uniform Plumbing Code, which is used widely in the West, it says that you can substitute a bottle filler for a drinking fountain to comply with the occupancy load requirement as it pertains to the minimum fixtures based on that occupancy load. Now this is in the plumbing codes. It's in also mentioned in some building codes in some places, but the reality of it is you have to meet the ADA first. The ADA is first. The ADA requires high-low drinking fountains. The ADA requires them on accessible routes through your property, and however many routes you might have, you might want to consider them on each and every one of them. And that's first. Once having met that, if your occupancy load does require more drinking fountains than what the minimum requirement of the ADA would be for your particular site, then you could substitute one of those drinking fountains for a bottle filler.
Well, thank you so much for all of your expertise, Kelly. As stated previously, but a lot of people are asking, we will be providing these PowerPoint slides for you to stick on your desktop and refer to later when you're specifying Hawes product. Just kidding. Not really. I'm going to move it back to you, Justin.
I just wanted to thank Kelly again for attending and answering our questions. We really appreciate having an expert like you accessible to us. And then for everybody attending, please take the information you've learned today, go forth, do good, create compliance, and please reference back to us if you need anything at all. So thank you for attending our webinar, and have a wonderful day.